Spring, 1945. Hereford, Texas. Irma Klein stepped through the gate expecting wire, watchtowers, maybe dogs. Instead, she saw a sign, painted wood, nailed beside the mess hall. Faded red letters, in both English and German. Free minds, free world. She squinted, thought it was a joke. Behind her, the bus engine coughed and faded into the Texas wind. Ahead, neat gravel paths, whitewashed barracks, and something she hadn't expected to see behind barbed wire. A building with glass windows, a painted door, and through the glass, shelves, shelves of books. A woman stepped out, carrying a stack. Not a soldier, a librarian. Irma turned to Hilda beside her and muttered, "What kind of prison has a library?" Then she saw the cover of the top book. A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf. And for the first time since surrendering, she felt something worse than fear. She felt curious. Winter, 1944. Near Kassel. Snow drifted quietly between the radio towers. Inside the listening station, Irma Klein adjusted her headset, pencil poised above the signal sheet. Morse code pinged through the static. She decoded it faster than most men. B-17s, 28, west-southwest. Another bombing run, another day in service of the Reich. She didn't flinch. Irma had always believed in the structure of things. Trains ran on time. Roles were fixed. Men fought. Women supported. That was how order was maintained. She'd joined the Luftnachrichtenhelferin at 21, the women's auxiliary of the Luftwaffe. Not to rebel, not to question, but to serve. With precision, with silence. Her officers praised her. Calm under pressure, obedient to the code. "Not like those American girls," they'd say. "Too loud, too many opinions, no backbone." The room would chuckle, and Irma would smile, because deep down she pitied them, those painted, smiling faces on war posters. Working machines they didn't understand. Marching with slogans instead of flags. She thought, they're not soldiers, they're distractions. But in the final months of 1944, distraction became domination. The B-17s flew higher, dropped heavier payloads. Every shift brought new frequencies, new losses. Kassel burned. Still, Irma clung to her station, still believed in maps, in codes, in Himmler's voice echoing across loudspeakers promising victory from sacrifice. Then one morning, the airfield was gone. Not bombed, evacuated. They were loaded into trains, wounded, nurses, comm officers, westbound, unsure if they were being rescued or surrendered. The train car reeked of oil, bread, and quiet despair. Through the slits in the wooden boards, she saw fields, wide, untouched, foreign. At a small station, an American nurse climbed aboard. She moved with casual authority, spoke German, handed out bandages, chocolate, pamphlets. Irma refused the chocolate, but she took the pamphlet. She didn't read it then, but she kept it in her coat pocket, just in case. When they crossed into Texas weeks later, the sun hit like a slap, dry, hot, vast. Through the haze, she saw fences, barbed wire, and beyond them, a building with curtains, a sign with the word library. She turned to the Red Cross escort. "This is a prisoner camp?" He smiled. "It's America. Even our enemies read." Irma said nothing. But something inside her, something carefully arranged, began to loosen. Not collapse, not yet, but like a zipper slowly pulled open. And behind it, the first draft of doubt. The morning heat rose early in Hereford. Dust swirled in lazy spirals across the yard as Irma stepped out of the barracks for roll call. Then she saw it, rolling slowly between the barracks on squeaky wheels. A cart, stacked high with books, pushed by a woman in a cotton skirt and short-sleeved blouse. No uniform, no escort, no fear. She stopped beside the laundry shed and called out in German-accented English, "Ladies, today's circulation includes translations. Kafka, Goethe, Virginia Woolf." Irma froze mid-step. Virginia who? The cart creaked closer. The books gleamed in the sun, some new, some worn. Irma noticed the labels. Neatly typed, catalogued, numbered. Every title stamped. Camp Hereford Library, POW Education Division. Two younger women walked over and began flipping through covers. One pulled out a book with a red spine and laughed. "Look at this. The Second Sex. What nonsense." Irma lingered behind them, eyes narrow. On the top row lay a thin book, white cover, blue lettering. A Room of One's Own. She didn't touch it. Not yet. But the title haunted her all afternoon. Why would a woman need a room? Wasn't the world already theirs? In silence? In shadow? In obedience? That night, she found herself unable to sleep. The air was thick. A radio played distant swing music in the guard station. Somewhere, someone laughed, unbothered. Irma sat up, slipped on her shoes, and stepped outside. Across the yard, the library door stood slightly ajar. Light spilled through the glass like a quiet invitation. She walked toward it, slowly, like someone approaching an altar. Inside, rows of books lined the walls, some in English, some in German, some with notes tucked inside written by hand. She didn't dare touch them yet, but her eyes scanned the titles. "We," "The Hand That Rocks the Cradle," "My Mother Works at Boeing." Not propaganda, not ideology, stories. From women, for women. The next morning, the cart came again. This time, Irma stepped forward. She didn't say a word. She just reached out and took A Room of One's Own from the top shelf. Its spine cracked softly in her hands, and the war inside her mind began. The library was silent. Not like silence on a battlefield, tense, listening. This was different. This was peace. Unnerving, undemanding peace. Irma sat in a wooden chair by the window, the book in her lap. A Room of One's Own. She opened the cover. The paper was soft, the type uneven, like an old letter. Her eyes drifted to the first sentence. A woman must have money and a room of her own, if she is to write fiction. She blinked, then read it again. She had never read anything like it. Not in school, not in the party journals, not in her mother's house. A woman, writing about women, as if they mattered. Not as wives, not as nurses, not as mothers of future soldiers, but as minds. Later that day, she returned to the library, said nothing, just walked past the Red Cross volunteer, nodded once, and picked a second book from the shelf. The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir. She read the first page standing. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. Her stomach tightened. The sentence felt dangerous, not because it was wrong, because it felt true. Back in the barracks, Elsa laughed when she saw the books. "They're softening you," she said. "The Americans are clever. They don't beat us with guns. They poison us with ideas." Irma didn't argue, but she didn't close the book either. That night, she lay awake, rereading a single paragraph under the dim yellow lamp. When she tries to define herself, she discovers she has no voice, because she was never taught she had one. She closed the cover, stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in her life, Irma wondered, Have I ever had a thought that wasn't given to me? The next morning she watched as the other women passed the library without pause, laughed at the American guards, scoffed at the softness of the camp. She stayed quiet, but the words followed her, like echoes in a place she'd once believed was soundproof. The camp no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a mirror. And she was starting to see someone she didn't recognize looking back. The library was silent. Not like silence on a battlefield, tense, listening. This was different. This was peace. Unnerving, undemanding peace. Irma sat in a wooden chair by the window, the book in her lap. A room of one's own. She opened the cover. The paper was soft, the type uneven, like an old letter. Her eyes drifted to the first sentence. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. She blinked, then read it again. She had never read anything like it. Not in school, not in the party journals, not in her mother's house. A woman writing about women, as if they mattered. Not as wives, not as nurses, not as mothers of future soldiers, but as minds. Later that day, she returned to the library, said nothing, just walked past the Red Cross volunteer, nodded once, and picked a second book from the shelf. The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir. She read the first page standing. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. Her stomach tightened. The sentence felt dangerous, not because it was wrong, because it felt true. Back in the barracks, Elsa laughed when she saw the books. "They're softening you," she said. "The Americans are clever. They don't beat us with guns, they poison us with ideas." Irma didn't argue, but she didn't close the book either. That night she lay awake, rereading a single paragraph under the dim yellow lamp. When she tries to define herself, she discovers she has no voice, because she was never taught she had one. She closed the cover, stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in her life, Irma wondered, have I ever had a thought that wasn't given to me? The next morning, she watched as the other women passed the library without pause, laughed at the American guards, scoffed at the softness of the camp. She stayed quiet. But the words followed her, like echoes in a place she'd once believed was soundproof. The camp no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a mirror. And she was starting to see someone she didn't recognize looking back. The library was silent. Not like silence on a battlefield, tense, listening. This was different. This was peace. Unnerving, undemanding peace. Irma sat in a wooden chair by the window, the book in her lap, a room of one's own. She opened the cover. The paper was soft, the type uneven, like an old letter. Her eyes drifted to the first sentence. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. She blinked, then read it again. She had never read anything like it. Not in school, not in the party journals, not in her mother's house. A woman writing about women as if they mattered, not as wives, not as nurses, not as mothers of future soldiers, but as minds. Later that day, she returned to the library, said nothing, just walked past the Red Cross volunteer, nodded once, and picked a second book from the shelf. The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir. She read the first page standing. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. Her stomach tightened. The sentence felt dangerous. Not because it was wrong, because it felt true. Back in the barracks, Elsa laughed when she saw the books. "They're softening you," she said. "The Americans are clever. They don't beat us with guns. They poison us with ideas. Irma didn't argue, but she didn't close the book either. That night she lay awake, rereading a single paragraph under the dim yellow lamp. When she tries to define herself, she discovers she has no voice, because she was never taught she had one. She closed the cover, stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in her life, Irma wondered, have I ever had a thought that wasn't given to me? The next morning, she watched as the other women passed the library without pause, laughed at the American guards, scoffed at the softness of the camp. She stayed quiet, but the words followed her. Like echoes, in a place she'd once believed was soundproof. The camp no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a mirror. And she was starting to see someone she didn't recognize, looking back. The next afternoon, Irma stood at the circulation desk. She held 2 books in her hands, both read twice already. She wasn't sure why she came back, only that she had to. The librarian looked up, a tall woman in her 50s with silver hair tied in a knot. Her name tag read, Margaret, Red Cross Library Corps. Irma cleared her throat. These books, she said, they are not restricted? Margaret smiled gently. No restrictions here. Even political ones? All ideas are allowed. Irma blinked. In Germany, she said quietly, we burned books like these. Margaret nodded. And that's why we ship them here, so you'll never have to again. Later, as Irma sat beneath the open window, reading 3 Guineas, she watched a bird land on the windowsill. For a moment, it did nothing, just sat there, free. Like the sentence she'd just read, freedom is not given, it is claimed. In the mess hall that evening, another POW, Marlene, raised an eyebrow at the copy of the Feminine Mystique under Irma's arm. Planning a rebellion? She joked. Irma didn't smile. I'm learning to recognize one. That night, Irma returned to the library after hours. The door was unlocked, the lights low, the smell of paper thick in the air. She wandered the shelves without looking for anything in particular. Then her fingers brushed a folder marked Internal Library Policy, POW Camp System. She opened it. Inside was a single page, typewritten, stamped. Rules for Camp Libraries, 1944. All books must be accessible to POWs. No titles denied on basis of ideology. Requests from prisoners must be honored when possible. Goal: exposure, not enforcement. She read that last line again. Exposure, not enforcement. She sat down on the floor, back against the shelf. No guards, no checkpoints, no eyes watching, only choices, only ideas. By the time she stood again, hours had passed. She replaced the folder, smoothed her skirt, and walked into the night air. The stars above Texas shimmered like quiet sparks. No sirens, no shadows. For the first time since arriving, she didn't feel imprisoned. She felt uncertain. And in that uncertainty, a dangerous clarity began to grow. 2 weeks later, the library received a crate marked with red tape and army postage. Inside, books, magazines, and something Irma hadn't seen before. Letters, dozens of them, tied with string, each addressed simply. To a woman on the other side. Margaret, the librarian, set the bundle on the desk. They're from women's groups, she said. Volunteers, churchgoers, teachers, factory workers. They said if you're reading our books, you should hear our voices too. Irma hesitated, then untied the first bundle. The paper was lined, the handwriting uneven, casual. Dear reader, my name is Louise. I work at the Boeing plant in Seattle. I never thought I'd build planes, but now I do, and I love it. If you're reading this, I hope you're safe. I hope you know it's okay to think for yourself. Irma read it 3 times, then opened the next. We sent books, but they're not weapons, they're mirrors. Maybe you'll see something you forgot. And another. I grew up in Mississippi. I wasn't allowed to read what I wanted. Until I was. It changed everything. Irma sat down in the corner of the reading room. The stack of letters lay beside her. Each one a window. Not boasting, not accusing. Just women. Speaking freely. About work, love, doubt, loneliness. Some had husbands at war. Others had lost brothers in Normandy. One woman had a child with polio and still found time to send books to POW camps. She wasn't trying to convert her. She was trying to connect. That night, Irma lay awake with her eyes open. She didn't cry, but her throat ached like she had. She remembered her own mother, quiet, worn, bent by years of sacrifice. She remembered how her sister Greta once whispered about wanting to paint and was sent away for correction. She remembered burning pamphlets in school, pages curling in fire while teachers nodded in approval. In the dark, she whispered to no one, "They are not weak." And the silence answered back, "They are free." The argument began quietly, a disagreement over a sentence in the second sex. By mid-afternoon, it had turned into a fire. 5 women circled the reading table, voices sharp, hands slicing the air. "She says marriage is a prison," Elsa snapped. "That's absurd." "Maybe not for her," replied a younger POW named Marta. "Maybe she never had a choice." Irma stood nearby, book in hand, heart pounding. "You're letting them brainwash you," another woman hissed. "These books, they're poison wrapped in ribbons." "No," Marta shot back. "They're mirrors. You're angry because you don't like what you see." A silence fell over the table, and then Irma spoke. She didn't raise her voice, didn't preach, just placed her book on the table, spine up, and said, "Perhaps we were not meant to obey. Perhaps we were just never allowed to question." It was the softest sentence in the room, but it landed like a grenade. No one moved. Elsa stared at her like she'd slapped someone. But Irma didn't flinch, because in that moment she felt something stronger than fear. Clarity. Later that day, she sat alone by the window, with Harper's Monthly open in her lap. An article caught her eye, an op-ed titled "Education as Defense." It read, "We arm our citizens, not just with bullets, but with books. Literacy is our first line of freedom." She closed the magazine and looked out over the yard. A supply truck rumbled past. 2 American guards laughed at something on the radio. A female librarian carried another stack of books into the barracks. No rifles, no sermons, just movement, just structure, just choice. That night, Irma walked to the library one last time before curfew. She didn't borrow anything. She simply stepped inside and placed a slip of paper on the suggestion board, written in pencil in German. "We were not defeated by force. We were defeated by permission." Back in the barracks, Elsa didn't speak to her, but Marta did. She passed Irma a folded piece of paper. Inside was a quote, handwritten, from Woolf. "As long as she thinks of a man, nobody objects to a woman thinking." Irma folded the paper, put it in her journal, and wrote beneath it, "Now I think of no one, only what I was never allowed to know." By June, the library had expanded. 2 more shelves, a new filing cabinet, and a bulletin board covered in clippings from American newspapers. the New York Times, Stars and Stripes, even Good Housekeeping. Irma walked in and saw a new poster on the wall. Books for Victory, over 122,000 titles, donated to POW camps. It showed crates being loaded onto ships, rows of women volunteers smiling beneath a banner. Read to remember why we fight. Irma stood still, staring at it. They were winning the war, not just with fuel and steel, but with paper. Margaret, the librarian, unpacked a fresh shipment. Irma helped, silently, placing each spine upright. One box was labeled Education, Domestic. Women's Studies. She pulled out a title, Not for Ourselves Alone, the story of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And another, The Common Reader. Then she saw a card slipped between two books, hand-typed, yellowed at the edges. It read, Every library in this system is a front line. Literacy is our armor. Ideas are our ammunition. U.S. Army Service Libraries Division. Irma stared at it like she was holding an artifact from a civilization she hadn't known existed. Because she hadn't. Back in the barracks, Hilda watched her return with yet another book in her arms. Still reading the enemy's gospel? She asked. Irma didn't answer. She just opened the book and began reading aloud. To vote is to exist. To read is to resist. Hilda turned away, but she listened. That night, Irma wrote in her journal, They fight with machines, but they also fight with memories. They do not erase the past. They print it. Their women build planes and print truths. She paused, then added, And I was never taught how to build anything, only how to obey. The next morning, she arrived early at the library, before the others, before the cart rolled in. She wanted the silence. She wanted the books. She wanted what the camp had given her, that the Reich never had, a place where she was allowed to think. In July, the library received something different. Not novels, not philosophy, manuals, blueprints, curriculum guides from American high schools. Irma held one open, stunned. It was a government-issued textbook, stamped Office of War Information. The lesson titles read, How a Bill Becomes Law, The Role of Women in American Industry, Media Literacy and Critical Thinking. She flipped to the back, a section titled, Suggested Debate Topics for Young Citizens. One prompt made her stop breathing. Should the government be allowed to restrict books in wartime? Irma looked up at Margaret, the librarian. You teach this to children? Margaret nodded. High school students, every state. Irma closed the book slowly. She imagined a German classroom, a blackboard with a Führer portrait, students repeating slogans in unison, no questions asked. And now, she imagined American children debating censorship while their fathers fought overseas. It wasn't just education. It was preparation. At the far end of the room, a map hung above the reading desk. A timeline stretched across the top, U.S. literacy rates since 1900. The final entry, 1945, 97% literate. Germany's hovered below 75%. And that was before the war burned half its schools to the ground. That afternoon, a group of American soldiers unloaded another crate. Inside were books wrapped in waxed paper, magazines, voting guides, pamphlets from the League of Women Voters. One leaflet read, How to Run a Town Hall, a guide for first-time female leaders. Irma whispered the title to herself. It felt like fiction, but it wasn't. She walked outside into the sun, shielding her eyes. Across the yard, two POWs were arguing. One accused the Americans of flooding them with ideology. The other replied, "At least they trust us to read." Irma passed them without a word. She was no longer shocked, only ashamed it had taken her so long. That night, she sat with her journal. "They did not teach obedience," she wrote. "They taught permission, to speak, to vote, to learn, and to disagree." Then one last line. "We were taught fear. They were taught freedom, and it shows." August 1945. Heat shimmered on the roofs of the barracks. Victory parades echoed across the ocean. But in Hereford, Irma sat quietly at a wooden desk, a stack of leaflets spread before her. The top one bore a title stamped by the U.S. Office of War Information: American Production and Education, by the numbers. She read every line, slowly, deliberately. 300,000 aircraft built, 6 million American women in the workforce, 122,000 books shipped to POW camps, 17 million new library cards issued during wartime. Another line, underlined in blue: 1 book per soldier, 1 book per prisoner, 1 idea per mind. She closed her eyes. The Luftwaffe had flown with steel, but America, it flew on literacy. Elsewhere on the sheet, 97% national literacy rate. 2 million women trained in technical reading and design. Over 50% of wartime factory manuals simplified for female workers without reducing content. That line made her pause. Not dumbed down, adapted, respected. She thought of Elsa, of Hilda, of the girls back home who were told not to think too much because it would make them unhappy wives. She thought of Greta, sent to a camp for wanting to study engineering. And she thought of the pamphlet she had refused on the train to Hereford, still folded in her coat pocket. She unfolded it now. Its title, printed in plain type: Women's Vote Since 1920, A Democratic Legacy. She turned to the back. A quote from Susan B. Anthony: "No man is good enough to govern any woman without her consent." Irma whispered the sentence aloud, let it settle in the room like incense. Then picked up her pen. In her journal, she wrote one final page. "They won this war before it started. They outproduced us in tanks, yes, but they also outproduced us in thought. They taught their daughters to read, to speak, to argue. We taught ours to kneel." She paused, then added, "If an army marches on its stomach, a civilization moves on what it teaches its women." Later that week, she overheard a young POW laugh at a copy of the Feminine Mystique. He called it American nonsense. Irma didn't answer. She simply turned the page and kept reading. Because now the numbers meant something more than statistics. They were proof. Proof that while Germany had trained women to sacrifice, America had trained them to build. And that, more than any plane or tank, was the weapon they never saw coming. Autumn, 1953, Berlin. Irma stepped through the glass doors of the new public library on Friedrichstrasse. Dust still clung to the windows. The war had ended 8 years ago, but the rebuilding was slow, brick by brick, word by word. Inside, the air smelled of plaster and ink. She walked past the shelves quietly. Her fingers brushed the spines of titles she once feared. Now they felt like old friends. Then she saw it. Worn cover, soft blue letters, a room of one's own. She pulled it down. Her hands shook a little, not from fear, from memory. She opened the first page. Inside was something folded, a bookmark, yellowed, brittle, but intact. Across the top, American Red Cross, POW Library Division. Below that, a slogan: read freely, think deeply, choose bravely. She stared at it for a long time, then smiled. Not because it was sentimental, but because it was real. Outside, the city moved. Trams rattled. Children shouted in the courtyard. A woman balanced groceries on one hip and a newspaper on the other. None of it felt impossible anymore. Because now, women in Berlin could vote, could read, could speak, could remember. Irma walked to the checkout desk. The librarian stamped the book without a glance, slid it across. "Would you like a new bookmark?" she asked. Irma shook her head. "No," she said. "This one brought me back." She left the library and stood on the steps for a moment. The sun warmed her face. She tucked the book under her arm and looked down at the street, where a young girl in a school uniform walked past, backpack heavy with books, brow furrowed in thought. Irma watched her disappear into the crowd, then whispered, almost to herself, "Let her read. Let her question. Let her never need permission again